All right, we are live. What's up, Michael Fertik? It's so happy to have you join us.
Thank you, Yoel. I'm very glad to
Oh,
be here.
yeah, me too. So we actually got connected. I did a live or an interview with my friend Akiva Gersh, who's the vegan rabbi, and someone reached out to me and said you got to interview Michael. And so he made the introduction, and first thing I did, like everything else I do, is I pulled up your LinkedIn page, and I was like, oh my God, I absolutely not just must speak to Michael, I must do a LinkedIn Live with him.
Okay.
So first, I'd like to know a little bit about you, what you do professionally, and we'll go into that. You're an author. You wrote a really cool book that I want to learn more about that takes place in Tel Aviv. But first and foremost, as a LinkedIn marketer and as many of my audiences on LinkedIn, and we're doing a LinkedIn Live,
Yes.
how did you get that little LinkedIn influencer logo?
You know, okay. Well, I don't know actually. The divinities of social media are hard to predict. I don't recall exactly how I got it. I think I was one of the first 50 or 100 LinkedIn influencers. This is already whatever 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. And I'm not sure how I got nominated or how I got knighted. you know, anointed. Um, but as a result, I do have a lot of followers on LinkedIn. I think it's 134,000 something. But the difference is
But who's
that,
counting?
well, I just checked because we were talking about it right before our broadcast. So I just checked. The thing about it is, I think we're almost all humans. Right? LinkedIn seems to have. I mean, there are definitely some bots on LinkedIn and stuff, and some fake people. But I think that the vast majority of people on LinkedIn and followers are real humans. Whereas I'm not sure that's true on a Twitter or on a Facebook. I think Twitter and Facebook are far more infested by bots and stuff.
Yeah,
So,
you don't have
so
Twitter
on
eggs.
LinkedIn, it's cool. I mean, when I post on LinkedIn, sometimes people really pay attention and amplify it and talk about it and react a lot, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't. I mean, it's hard to tell exactly what catches the eyes of people, but I'm pretty active on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Great. So you have no idea how you got it. So you can't. I reached out to LinkedIn 5 years ago, and I was like, "How do I got that influencer thing? I really
Uh-huh.
want to know." And I reached out to like every single one of my contacts independently, and then
Yeah.
they got back to me, and they're like, "We know you're all asking us independently." This is several years ago, because they
Yeah,
all
I don't
speak.
know. I don't know why the companies that do this are so mysterious about this. Maybe it gives them room to maneuver and decide, what's in their within their parameters and what's not. I just don't know. I don't know. And once LinkedIn sold to Microsoft, that's probably another set of rules and all that.
Oh God. I mean, to be honest, they weren't much better before.
Okay.
But
Okay. Well, okay.
okay, cool. So. Great. So anyway, so what we have here, so you're in California and
Yeah.
you're a V, right? You're involved in the VC world, right? And you talk about technology a lot in Israel, and you're very familiar with the tech scene in Greater Tel Aviv or and in Israel. I'd like to get a better idea, maybe from you, possibly. What is it? How did you end up becoming a VC, doing VC venture capitalism? One, and then what is your connection to Israel and Israeli technology in particular?
Okay, there's a lot there, and I'm happy we have a lot of time, so I'm happy to take it step by step. Let's come back to my history with Israel in a second, but suffice to say right now that I have a great passion for Israel. I am an overt Zionist, and I talk about my interest in Israel. I talk about my Zionism openly and frequently. And we'll come back to how I got there if you want, from a family way and a personal history way, in a second. I kind of retired in 2015 ish, and from a long haul of being an entrepreneur, chiefly a founder of tech startups, and the kind of the tech startup that many people will have heard of, that I sort of retired into an executive chairman role from the CEO job, is called Reputation. Now called Reputation. Used to be called Reputation.com, and before that was called Reputation Defender. But anyway, suffice it to say, Reputation. And and I was deciding in my life for a few reasons what to do next. in about 2014, 15. And I realized that one of the things I wanted from the next chapter of my life, the next, say, 10 years, God willing, starting around 2015, was a more regular connection and more frequent connection to Israel. I've been living in California, and I had been traveling to Israel for personal reasons and some professional reasons over the years. But I wanted to do more with Israel. And there are a few ways to do that. You can live there, which I did not think was going to be likely in my near-term future for a few reasons. You can give philanthropically to Israeli institutions and so forth. Or you can be involved in business, for example. There are many ways, right? You have many ways to do that. And I decided that I was going to explore being involved in a business way in Israel. And I, at the same time, was thinking about switching my focus from daily entrepreneurship to more active venture investing. And as an entrepreneur at the time, I had been only in high tech. Since then, I have become also a life sciences entrepreneur, thankfully, with good news. But I decided to look at Israel and then look at investing at the same time. And so what came out of that was what is called Heroic Ventures, which is my venture fund. It's Heroic VC. And we invest basically only in Silicon Valley and Israel. And part of the thesis of how we invest, part of when we want to invest and so forth, was formed based on a series of trips I took with a lot of frequency starting at the end of 14 into 15, looking for certain kinds of deals, realizing that wasn't really what I was supposed to be doing, and then modifying and evolving my plan, and then investing in Israel. So what we try to do in a nutshell, what I try to do in a nutshell is I try to be the first investor, meaning in the very first financing, but either before or with your friends and family, in Israeli startup, and I try to actually be there before the Israelis, and I can tell you why if you want. And then in the last 5-6 years, it's gone very well, thank God, and I can tell you about that if you want. Some of the name brand companies of Israel are now in the portfolio, including Sunbit, including Next Silicon, including Sentinel-1, which is now a very large public company. I can tell you about how we got into those and so forth.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious. It's fascinating.
Happy to, and thank God it's been very good. And then the Israeli VC landscape has changed very fast. I mean, much faster than the American one.
Why is that?
Over the last few years. Why is that? Well, if you look around the parking lot around the world in high tech, set aside life sciences for a second. If you look around high tech, there are, in terms of exits, $1 billion plus exits, not valuations. There's so many unicorns now. They're kind of 10 to 15-ish billion plus exits per year in Silicon Valley. And there are another few per year around America somewhere. And that number is growing, but all of America combined is a few more per year, basically. And then there's Silicon Valley about 10 to 12. And that'll shift as the tides shift around America. If you look around China, it's at a different ecosystem, a closed world. It's got its own. India, relatively similar. Europe has 1 to 2 per year, maybe 2 to 3 per year now. And Israel has 1 to 2 per year. So Israel basically has as many exits of that size per year as Europe, right? Continental Europe plus the UK. And it's probably a little on the margin, a little more in Europe, but I mean, we're talking about a very tiny country versus a very large continent. And I think that's the number one reason there's more investment coming to Israel. When there's more investment coming to Israel, there's good exits. You're going to have a changing landscape. That's one. The second thing is that there are more guys like me coming to Israel. So Americans with American-style term sheets. Israeli VC historically, recently has been a lot, probably more similar to the way American VC was 20 years ago, and the way VC is in Europe or in other parts of the world. The term sheets are tougher. The terms are tougher for the entrepreneurs. And then once you have a number of investors come from America who are interested in investing in Israeli startups, the pressure changes. So the the standard term sheet goes from a little tougher to a little kinder, more pro entrepreneur, more pro founder, and then the local VCs are going to respond in kind. And then a lot of the Israeli entrepreneurs, that's the second reason, a lot of the Israeli entrepreneurs, third reason I'd say, have had successes now, and so they can self-fund for the first $1 million, $2 million, $3 million of their company, and then they can afford to go straight to the American VCs, skipping the Israeli VCs. And as a result, the Israeli VCs say, hey, look, we want to play harder. We want to get into these deals, and we don't want to be skipped. So we're going to raise larger funds and invest more money. Instead of trying to invest $500,000 or $1 million, they might invest $2 to $5 million and pay higher prices and higher valuations. Mm-hmm. So they're responding. And then the funds are getting bigger, which is ancillary to the third reason. And they're investing more. So because they have to invest the money they're raising. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And then the formula for the successful Israeli startup has become more clearly defined. And this will shift right over time. But basically right now, the way you're a successful, the modal Israeli startup that's successful is probably something like an enterprise-facing SaaS company that builds its technology in Israel and sells only in the US.
Right. We have a handful of clients like that, so yeah. We know very well.
Yeah, and there's some exceptions. I mean, look, Sunbit's a consumer-facing product, but their customers are car dealerships and places where really enterprises. So I guess they may not be an exception. And then of course cyber. So you'd think that cyber would be a solved problem by now, but of course it's not. And,
do you think there's a bubble? Because I speak to the majority of our clients are cybersecurity clients. And we have a lot of cybersecurity technology startups within our agency. And I speak to some of my clients, and they think that many people think that there's a bubble. I don't think so. I think it's a wave, if anything. But because we're playing I think enterprises are playing catch up with their vulnerabilities. But do you think, so many companies are getting funding that don't have revenue? And I think the CEO of Checkpoint said something recently regarding the fact that he thinks that there's a bubble. I don't believe him, because I think it's very easy for larger organizations to, to kind of make it harder for those up and coming and their competitors. I think it's just human nature. So, I take it with a grain of salt. But I do agree that there's an insane amount. Do you think we'll continue to see this amount? And do you think it's a bubble, or do you think it's just a wave?
Amount of what?
Amount of cybersecurity companies that are getting insane amount of funding. Particularly, I'm seeing before pre-revenue.
So let's talk about cyber sort of second, and let's talk about the kind of the bubble of tech now, if there's a bubble in tech now. So on the one hand, technology is sort of eating the world, right? So the large back of the global economy, from construction to housing to healthcare to automotive, is now being upended by new technology companies, aviation, right? So in that sense, sort of technology is going to be taking a lot of the GDP and eating it. And then also a lot of the GDP is growing, right? The GDP is also growing, thank God, globally. So those are two trends that suggest that tech will be favored over time. That's sort of statement one. Statement two is, are valuations higher? And so you start with the public markets, and a lot of the public commentary, I'm not a public securities person, but a lot of the public commentary, this is easy for you to research yourself, says that multiples of earnings and so forth are at historic or ahistoric highs, or only a few times in the past has this ever happened. And then that trickles down to the private markets. And I'm seeing companies that are at tens of millions of revenue run rate, getting billions of dollars of valuation, and run by some pretty questionable people in some cases. And I think diligence is just not happening the way it used to be, and or maybe it should. The velocity of money is increasing. Some of the great late stage funds are doing 2 deals a week or 5 deals a week at $1 billion plus valuation. So there's just a lot of velocity. Third, the amount of money that's been printed in the last 20
I heard
months.
I heard 60% of all U.S. dollars were printed last year.
Something like that, right?
I was like, that. I mean, I
And
was
so
like,
that's got to go somewhere.
whoa.
So
All
so
right.
so you know, it's you know, if you believe that gas is, you know, at the pump, it has an 8% or whatever inflation. Well, you know, you'd imagine that there'd be some huge inflation in other parts of the market, like tech, and of course a higher rate of inflation, it seems. Um, but so there's a kind of inflationary pressure that's happening because all this money has to go somewhere, and you can't put in the bank. This is not financial advice, but the average person might say, "Look, I get 0.5% interest rate at the bank account. Why would I
I
do
don't
that
think
instead
anyone
of
says that.
trying something?" What?
I don't think anyone says I'm going to park my cash in the bank
Well, that's
because it
part of the
gives me a
issue. So where do
0.5%.
they put it? And then you know, these things sort of bubble up to these valuations. And then if you have a larger venture fund, right? If your venture fund today is $700 million, whereas 5 years ago your last fund was $100 million, you have to put 7x more money to work, and so you might be a little more loosey goosey in your decision making. You might want to spend more per investment. Um, so valuations are high, and then the question is, when does this bubble? So yes, from a valuation perspective, yes, I think we're in a bubble. And when does this end is anyone's question. Some of the smart people I know
But
think that the Fed is going to let this party go till at least 2024. Some people think that inflation will go
yeah,
down. Some people think
I don't see the Fed getting involved at all. I think they keep kicking that can down the road, and I feel like it might be partly political. Like it's not in their political interest to have this bubble burst on them. And since the
well,
Fed's appointed them,
certainly a reasonable thing to suspect, right? But it's anyone's guess. You and I can agree. And then does inflation then get chased by deflation? You know, could there be, God forbid, some kind of war or something? Could Poland
right?
and erupt? Could Taiwan erupt? God forbid. Who knows? So there's a kind of a tough situation in terms of, yes, I do think there's a bubble. Now, in terms of cyber and Israel in particular, um, I think my macro comment about the tech thing I just made, now the micro comment about cyber and Israel in particular, there is a uh, practice, an investing event style that has emerged only in the last 2-3 years, in which a bunch of funds that basically just do this move, or primarily do this move. This is their raison d'etre. This is why they exist. Look at a team, and often a very, very good team in cyber in Israel, and say, our first investment, based on your PowerPoint deck or whatever, meaning no product, no prototype, is going to be $5 to $6 million on a kind of a $10 to $15 million pre-money valuation. And we're seeing that happen in cyber a lot, and that's now bleeding over into SaaS. That is not cyber.
Explain to me how does that bleed over to SaaS?
I want to tell you why. I just met, as for example, with two just terrifically good cyber guys, and they're doing a consumer business, not cyber, and they have almost no history between the two of them in consumer. They have a great history both together and separately in cyber and Shorting Time and other, Office of the Prime Minister and other places like this that are very special. But I suspect, and I haven't asked them this directly, but I will soon, I suspect that one of the reasons they don't want to do cyber is they know that it's overhyped. But what's interesting is they came to me with basically the same valuation perspective. They have no product. They only have a deck. They want like 5 on 15, 20 posts. So they want the cyber hype in consumer, even though they're not consumer guys. So this, you see this movie a lot where people are like, oh yeah, my field is saturated. Let me go to this other field I don't know about, but get the same problem that is
And
evidenced by the saturation, as manifest through valuations from the field that I'm from. So I think it's going to bleed over. But cyber in particular in Israel, I do believe is very exciting. You have Sentinel-1, which I'm very, very proud to own, a lot, thank God, through my fund and so forth. it's just blowing the doors off of valuations, the largest cyber IPO ever, and so forth. So there's going to be a lot that chases that and validates it. Prior to SentinelOne, a lot of the cyber exits kind of topped out at $200-400 million, which, by the way, is a lot of money, right? But it's not 4 or 5 billion, which is what
It used to be a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
I know, joke.
Yeah. So there you are. I think. So anyway, I think that's where we are. So I think there is in fact a bubble going on, but on one hand, long may it continue. On the other hand, we have to be careful. We have to be careful what we're looking for. And also, when there is a bubble, your valuation decisions become even more important, because if the company raises so much money at a very high price and the bubble bursts, should that happen, then the markets become very unkind, and the next financing can be a significant down round or so forth. So, okay. So anyway, there you are. That's my answer.
Got it. All right. So, but do you think it's it's definitely a lot going on, whether it's a wave or a bubble. You seem to be not so sure either. If I were able to try to
I think it's a valuation bubble. I mean, let me not
evaluation bubble. They're overvaluating. But
yeah,
you do think these
I
companies
I think that the software eating the world will continue. I mean, I think that's whatever tech eating the world will continue. Right? I mean, the NASDAQ will. I mean, just using it as a symbol. I mean, I guess SentinelOne's on the New York Stock Exchange, so it's not necessarily a great symbol, but something that we might call the NASDAQ will continue to eat more of the world, probably.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Huh?
That doesn't surprise me. Well, what do you look for in startups that you would consider investing? Do you find how much is the technology? How much would you say is the founders? Of course, it's an all above approach. What exactly what are the main things that you consider that you would say differentiates you from other people in your industry when you consider a cybersecurity or technology company for investment?
Well, if you go around my office, I'll start with something funny. If you go around my office and you ask the team whether the team member is Israeli or American or Chinese, whatever extraction, whatever language is natively spoken in my office, I say, what's the number one reason not to invest in an Israeli startup? And they'll all answer the same question. They'll all answer that question the same way: if they have a single Israeli pilot. And of course, I'm not talking about Air Force pilots. That's a plus. I'm talking about like a pilot with an Israeli customer. I think it's pretty much disqualifying. It's not universally disqualifying. It was pretty much disqualifying. The best way, I think, to succeed in Israel almost always, and this is a game of averages, right? This is not a game of hard rules, but the averages produce rules that are rules of thumb or guidelines or hard rules, depending. Is if your company is selling to Israeli customers, it'll probably just not be an important company. And it may be what you want to do. It may be what's best for you and your lifestyle, but it's just not going to be a global company. It's not going to be an important startup in terms of financial outcome, in terms of size. Israeli customers are very demanding. They can just basically eat you alive, and they don't pay a lot. And there's no advantage to selling to them, right? So Israel has a terrific profile, where you have entrepreneurs who speak enough English or a lot of English. You have entrepreneurs who have ready access to America, and you can build in Israel and sell in America. It's no longer much cheaper to build in Israel. It is still cheaper to build in Israel than it is in Silicon Valley, but it's not cheaper to build your technology in Israel than it is to build it in other parts of the United States. But selling in America is very, very important. And I would say selling in America to the exclusion of most other places in the world, to the exclusion of Europe or Asia, at least at first. And if you can prove yourself there, then you're off to the races. So that's the one sort of funny part. In terms of what I look for, so I invest really early. I invest in team and TAM. So the team who are building the company and their total addressable market size. Those are the two things I probably care about most of the time. And that means I'm not looking at product market fit. So once a company has attained product market fit, it's often too late for us. It's often too expensive for us. And we can't do it. And there are 1,000 Series A or Series B funds that are looking to grab those deals. We're betting on the people and on the size of the market. And if you have software margins and you have great people and you're going after a big market and you're good entrepreneurs, then you have a pretty darn good chance of getting an outcome that's venture worthy, that's exciting. So that's what I look for.
Outside, what is so people talk about like Israel startup nation, so on and so forth. But from your perspective as a Californian, what do people see from the what do people like? What is their perspective of Israel in general for, let's say, those that have never been here like you have?
I think
From the technology standpoint, do they see it as startup nation like we do? We all see ourselves certainly,
they
and then
think
the
of
way we're
Israel
seen
as a
from the
very special
outside.
place. Yeah, they think of Israel as a very special place. I think that if you're talking about most people, most places are not very political, and I think you're asking a non-political question. So
That's correct.
most people, you would find who are interested in something called tech, let's say. So that's already a small number of people relative to the total population, are not going to have useful or interesting or strongly felt opinions about Israel as a state or as a political project. Instead, they're going to have some lightly held opinions about those topics at all, if at all, or they're going to have lightly held opinions about Israel as a startup place. And for sure, the opinions about Israel as a startup place are going to be extremely positive, right? Extremely high density of remarkable entrepreneurs and companies. There, I think 40,000 Israelis or something like that in Silicon Valley, for example. Very hardworking people, entrepreneurial. So very favorable opinions. Maybe a little more cyber than France or something like that. But
Right.
but very very positive, and deservedly so. Deservedly so. Yeah, I'd say it's very, very positive. And by the way, I mean, I mean, to be sure, I find that also true in the other parts of the Middle East I have visited and visit, and where I spend time virtually now or in person before coronavirus, right? There's an extremely positive attitude towards Israel as a tech place.
Correct.
And, even before the Abraham Accords in the UAE and in Saudi and the kingdom. I mean, so so even in the traditional
in Egypt, increasing now also, I've started to see some things down, like you can read the grape leaves, like kind of the grapevine, kind of you're starting to feel they're talking about water technology and all of that. So it's actually kind of fascinating, especially with the dams being built of the Nile. It's like stopping water flow to Egypt. So
by the way,
Ari,
I think you're making I don't know much about Egypt and Israel together in the tech interchange, but to be sure, ag tech, and you could include that in that water tech, is going to be a place where Israel has been a world leader since well before the tech boom, right? Since the days
correct.
of the
And us in the West aren't so familiar with it because we feel like, we turn on the water, we've all the water. We don't have the water challenges. I mean, let's say Western Europe and North America, that, let's say, Israel, the Middle East, and Northern Africa often have. So it's very important, the agriculture technology, water technology. So we have a question from Ari Khan. What do you think about property technology, the prop tech industry in Israel, if you have an opinion?
Yeah, so prop tech is a phrase, and thank you to Ari Khan for the question. Prop tech can be used to mean real estate facing technology, or it can be property management technology companies. Usually it's used to mean startups that are either trying to sell or commercialize real estate differently, or manage real estate differently, or capitalize real estate differently. And so if he has a particular subset of that he wants to ask about, I'm happy to answer it. But broadly speaking, we do have exposure to prop tech or real estate tech in Israel.
Is
Again,
that a growing industry in general?
huh?
Is that a growing industry? Because I don't hear it spoken about as prop tech, but I do come by a lot of technology within real estate and real estate management pretty regularly.
Yeah, some people call it prop tech. I mean, maybe Ari means something else, but that's kind of normally what I would
No, I
assume.
looked at his LinkedIn profile, so that is what he means.
Prop tech, yeah.
So,
Yeah, so look, we do have exposure to prop tech in Israel. Again, I think that on average, my personal opinion is that on average, by far, an Israeli prop tech company that has any customers in Israel is doing it wrong, and that is doing anything in Israel apart from building a startup and having a team is doing it wrong. Israel is just such a tiny country with a tiny GDP,
right.
and building your product there and then focusing on U.S. residential, U.S. commercial, or multifamily MRE, multifamily residential real estate uh, seems like a better bet. Maybe there's some reason to do it in Europe, but my guess is again, Israel to U.S. is a great advantage. And you have a lot of real estate families and executives in the United States, many of whom are Jewish or Jewishly affiliated, who are interested in Israel, who take an interest in Israeli startups and so forth, and Israeli success, who want to modernize, contemporize their portfolios and their investments, and are using their balance sheets also to assist these companies if they can, maybe sometimes helpfully, maybe sometimes not. So I do think you have a kind of a bit of a built-in potential advantage. I don't want to say something that's too strong because you can never know how people actually behave, and at the end of the day, the company has to perform.
Are there any VC funds around property tech?
Yeah, sure. There are many.
There's space for it. All right, there you go.
There,
Ari.
there are VC funds in the project area in the United States, and they're easy to find. They're easy to find. I don't particularly. In general, there must be exceptions, and I can probably think of one or two. But in general, I don't think that vertically integrated or vertically focused venture funds are historically successful on average compared to other venture funds, which are. It's also a tough asset class for the non-focused, non-vertically focused venture funds. But yeah, there are VC funds that focus on that vertical, and there will be more. And then there are also corporate venture funds in real estate that focus on the VC that focus on real estate.
So speaking of real estate, so Tel Aviv, I mean, the price of real estate in Tel Aviv is insane. And things have really, the prices, I mean, in all of Israel has really gone up like radically.
Let's talk
Definitely
about that
above.
for a second. So here, I don't want to make too much of it, and it sounds kind of fancy, but in some sense it is, but not to make too much of it. So I spent the last couple summers with my family in Sonoma. We rented a house in in a vineyard, and has vineyard attached to it or whatever, and very pretty. And I say to myself, and I said, why can't we do this in Israel? There's coronavirus, right? But ex-coronavirus, why couldn't you just have a beautiful place with a vineyard and so forth, and a beautiful place to spend time with your family in Israel? And so many kind of Maher Jewish guys and their families would do that, right? And then so I called some law firms that do real estate in Israel. And I quickly found out some of the major obstacles. So Israel, like something like 97% of the land outside of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem is owned by the state.
93.
93%. You're knowledgeable. And they run these kind of 50-year leases or 25-year leases or whatever.
50. I have one.
Okay. And then so many dunams or whatever. And then they do these auction lots, and then you have like this grid of auction lots where it's whatever 20 by 20 lots, and then by the way, you bid on them, but you can't necessarily guarantee that you're going to get contiguous lots. So, and then by the way, they make it difficult to kind of build even inside the green line. So never mind the politics outside the green line, to build like off the grid. So you have to have your house attached to the grid. You can't. And then if you want to have a kind of house, you have to have a working farm. And I guess the working farm definition is loose enough.
Old.
There's some,
It's also outdated.
well, all of this is what I'm getting at, which is to say that
Hmm.
you have this basically highly socialized socialist mechanism of land management, which
Hmm.
I guess is defensible if you're planning for the next 1,000 years, right? You want to sort of make sure you do it slowly and carefully so that big families don't gobble up all the land. And I understand that you want to preserve it for future generations and so forth. But it seems to me that you would have a lot of very valuable investment and also um, eco-friendly investment and water-friendly investment if you loosen some of these rules, whether or not they're on the seaside or in the hills or the Carmel or
Dude,
wherever
you're
it might
preaching the
be.
choir, man. It is
But,
unreal.
well, so
By the
so
way, you're
you're
the only
familiar
other
with this.
person I know that I speak to, at least an American, that most Israelis don't know this, that 90%, 93% is owned by the Israel Land Authority, or to call that it's state owned. And that's the whole reason. There's a supply limitation because it's state owned. There's regulation, and a lot of the pricing is like the Israeli EPA and all of that to make it so difficult to build.
So
And then there are
difficult.
other things that are unique to Israel that they make it now like earthquake resistant, and you have to have a bomb shelter with all new buildings, which is I think was a good regulation. So it does make it a little more expensive for regular housing, but that still doesn't. It should
Well,
still be half the price.
there's also some sort of discussion of the cost of materials and labor, and to be sure that'll factor in as well. But if the government if you just can't do it, if you're just
No,
not
you can't
allowed,
just buy a
if you're
plot of
just not
land.
allowed, then that's going to be probably 80% of the cost. And it just seems that after you know enough years post 48, there might be room for some reasonable beginning of land reform because how many people does Israel depend on for donations?
Mhm.
Would be delighted to have beautiful cultivated gardens and vineyards and homes and places and developments in Israel, in parts of Israel that are still kind of like rocky and scrappily. You could turn them into beautiful places. And so there's also the kind of the farming lobby is pretty strong in Israel, I understand. So anyway, look, this is no doubtedly undoubtedly beyond my pay grade. But I was just puzzled by how hard they made it to spend more money and more time in Israel.
So I'll tell you an interesting story. I several years ago, more than several, it's newlyweds, like 10 years ago. I reached out. I spoke to the CEO of JNF, which is now a client, Russell Robinson, great guy, and I suggested that why isn't there Boca Raton in Israel? Like, why are so many Jews going from right? I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Philly. Why are so many of them like moving to Florida? Why can't we make something similar in Israel? And so I made a business plan with him, 18 pages, and then he was like, "Okay, now go get funding." I was like, "We're gonna get funding." I was like 24, you know. I was like, "Get funding." I have like college debt up to here. I don't know nobody. And it's
Well,
fascinating because they have the land and they could do it. And I came up with a great business plan for revenue, naming roads after donors and the whole thing. But in the end, it's just the government seems to really get in the way of
there's
itself.
some of that. There's some of that, and whether it's Boca or whatever it is, you go to Caesarea where a lot of these fancy houses are, and
That's
it's
right next
weird.
door to
Like
me.
you're
That's where I live.
sort of near the beach,
Mhm.
but you're not at the beach. You're like sitting in a pool, and you're like 100 meters from the beach, and like you can't see the beach. It's weird. And
I'm right near Caesarea. We share a train. I'm in Pardes Khana. And
yeah,
people like, first off, the majority of houses in Pardes Khana are not owner occupied. So it's actually fascinated. They're actually rented, long term rentals. Second, I tell people, why would I live there? There isn't a real community because many of them aren't owner occupied. I'm a 5 minute extra drive from the beach to the golf course, all that. 98% of houses, 95% of houses at Caesarea, they still need to drive to the beach.
it's weird.
So I'll just drive an
Yeah,
extra
it's
six
weird.
minutes,
And then there are a
and I
couple of
don't pay the
other
property
yeah
tax, and I have better culture and better community where I'm at.
yeah.
And so why would I? And that's why people aren't moving there. So, but you definitely get the beach vibe town, even no matter how inland you are with Caesarea. It is nice. I want to talk about your book in a minute, but this is an interesting question related to something that you said that I think is related to a lot
Yeah.
of my audience. Right, so you're talking about if you only got Israeli customers, that's not enough to invest in, legit, right? So if you've only got Israeli customers and no American customer wants to work with someone, oh yeah, who are you working with? And it's just, small, local Israeli companies. How do they branch out? How do they overcome that, let's say that catch 22 challenge, so to speak, to get their first, let's say, American American client or even enterprise, ideally for a small startup?
So the question that's been put is, and thank you for asking. Hi, Michael. You mentioned before you don't usually invest in Israeli startups working only with Israeli customers. By the way, I never invest in startups. I hope I never invest in startups that are only working with Israeli customers. What I said was I prefer not to invest in a company that has even one Israeli customer. But the question is, how do you suggest a small startup reach its first U.S. customers? So let me answer in a very Jewish way, I think, which
I think
is
that's the best answer. You're answering with another question?
That's both a very good question and a really, really bad question. So let me start with why it's a good question. It's a good question because it's important. How do you do it? And it's a bad question because if you can't do it, then you're in the wrong business. So here, let me answer it now more seriously. Probably every successful Israeli startup you've ever heard of has managed to reach US customers quickly. And probably most of the Israeli startups that have not been successful have said, oh, this bank and that bank, they're running a startup accelerator program and they're going to work with me and Israeli, local Israeli banks. And I was in the army with a guy who now works over there at this kind of company over here in Israel. And so I'm going to work with him first. We're just going to run a pilot and so forth. And we're going to figure it out together. Then we're going to use that as evidence for the US market. So unfortunately, kind of the convenience and the familiarity of, we know these people, gets you a false positive. It gets you kind of an early pilot or something in Israel, but that leads to nothing, right? It's not really a proof point for American customers. And often
at all. You're saying even the contrary. You're saying even it might even be a negative, but you're saying to the typical American customer.
I don't think it's a negative as a proof point, but I do think it's a negative in the sense that the Israeli customer often consume all of your time, energy, and resources for the next 6 months or 12 months.
Got it. Yes.
And it doesn't buy you anything in terms of the proof with U.S. customers. And
what if you have like Bank Leumi, Bank Hapoalim? So if you're working with these larger, by Israeli standards, right, the largest banks in Israel, that's not enough to then maybe go to a medium-sized bank in America or a regional bank. As I'm choosing banking as an example.
I believe that, I'm not going to name names, but I believe that that kind of move will kill your company. I think that a lot that might kill your company with love. This is my personal private opinion. I'm not.
We want your personal private opinion. That's why you're here.
Like particular companies, but I think you could name the top 50 largest Israeli companies, and I would include them probably in this list of whom not to work with if you want your company to be large and successful. And the counterexamples that they might be able to provide are probably meaningless in my opinion, and they can be your 2,000th customer or your 5,000th customer, but I think on balance, the amount of energy and lift that you need to go get your first US customer is going to pay you back 10,000 fold compared to Israeli customers. Now, by the way, there are a lot of Israelis now working at American companies in America. And they are.
So you can use that connection.
And so you can have the familiarity if you want to. There are a lot of CISOs and CIOs and CTOs and marketing executives and business executives.
Right.
And so if that's your familiarity or your network, there's no reason not to start with your network, but it'll just repay you so much. But that focus.
Well, I want to interrupt. I want to add something to that. So for those who heard what Michael said, which is actually excellent, LinkedIn has a search feature where you can find out what university or school that they used to attend. So you can search for people that are working at certain enterprises, in certain locations, let's say in America, in your industry, their experience, and you can see did they go to Israel University, were they in the IDF, were they in 8200? All of this is often people's LinkedIn profile, and then message them directly, and you have a very warm starting point in order, hopefully, to build a relationship with potentially an American client.
Yeah,
go ahead.
And so I think that kind of being really hard-nosed about this and saying we will focus only on U.S. customers, unless there's some specific reason you need to be in UK or Germany, those are going to be very strong exception cases, for example. But being really, really focused and not making any excuses to take the easy path to Israeli customers I think is going to increase the chance of the average startup, is my opinion, will probably increase the chance of the average startup to succeed by many, many, many fold. And there's kind of no way around it.
Got it. So if someone wanted their first customer, an Israeli startup, okay, we're ready to go to market, ready to go to customer. Do you recommend them not try out first on an Israeli client at all?
Correct.
I mean, you should try and go to sell to America
Correct.
without even
And if,
having a
and if an
pilot or a
Israeli, and if an
client.
Israeli customer, if an Israeli customer is banging down your door, begging to be your customer, I would still say no.
Fascinating, because they'll eat up your time. They'll give you some false
Because
positives
on
about your
average, it
product.
will not pay you enough. On average, it will eat up your time. On average, their demands will be too high. And on average, it will buy you nothing in terms of credibility with larger US customers later, on average. That's my
That's an insane amount of value you
generalized advice.
provided. That's
Well,
awesome.
that's my generalized opinion.
That's great. That's great advice. That's really because people don't think about it. They think they're building a client and they're learning, but it's going to weigh them down, not pay them enough. They're going to burn through more cash, and they're going to try to do things to adapt to an Israeli client, which is not how you adapt to an American.
And I can't sitting right here right now, I can't think of a single exception to that point of view in my experience. Not a single exception.
So so you were saying try to work whatever network you have, whether it's through your investors, like I said, through LinkedIn search, whatever connections you might have, just try to get the connection. That's really fascinating. That's
and by the way, this is basic tachlis about how to do a startup, right? And so it's like asking the question, and this is why it was not a good question. It was a good question for some reasons and surfaced a lot of opinion, at least my opinion. But the reason it's not a good question is that it's so basic, mamash tachlis, basic stuff. It's like asking, how do I hire an engineer? I mean, it's that basic. If you can't do it, go do something else.
Awesome. Wow, fascinating. All right, so you're this great book called Hipset, right?
And hooray! Thank you.
Love it. Do you have it? Perfect. Lovely. Okay, so I put it in the chat 15 minutes ago, but we kept getting off topics.
I want to do a reveal of the cloth cover underneath, which you may not have seen yet.
No, wait, more beautiful. I love it.
Right,
I love
it. It's got the Magen David right there in silver.
It's beautiful. I love it. Okay, so before we went live, I was talking about how the fact that I don't read any fiction, and I was thinking about how I need to read some fiction, and if I am ever interested in fiction, it has to have like learning things, like philosophical, right? Something like like Ayn Rand or The Richest Man in Babylon, or something that's just how my brain is. I read a lot of nonfiction, and fiction honestly bores me, but I haven't read any in a while, and I was looking for it. So I'm excited for when this gets delivered and I can read it. Now, this takes place in Tel Aviv, and I want you to first tell us about it, and then I have some questions. I don't want to mislead you.
Well, thank you, Yoel. I'm very glad you're asking, and thanks to everybody. So this is my other life. My other life, I'm a writer, and this is my newest book. It's what I'm promoting today. I'm promoting this book, Hipset, and it takes place in Tel Aviv. It is an act of Zionism, this book, and I want to tell you just a couple things about it because I think you'll enjoy it. It's not yet translated into Hebrew, though I hope that's a project for next year, maybe. So it's a noir novel. So noir is spelled Noir, and some of the people in the audience will be familiar with Humphrey Bogart, right? Raymond Chandler, Maltese Falcon kinds of stories from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Noir is, in my opinion, one of the three great American art forms. You got the Western movie, you got jazz and its progeny, and you got noir. Now, other people will agree or disagree with my list of three, but that's my list of three. And noir is a kind of genre. It's a genre that requires an atmosphere that's very special and very specific. You need a city. It needs to take place in a city that is undergoing a lot of change with a lot of socioeconomic diversity and rapid change that results in political tension, economic tension, social tension, and that leads to murder somehow. The lowest of the low, the underworld, and the highest of the high, the political superstructure of the city and so forth, all come together in this hard boil, and then something takes place. And the detective is usually a man. It's usually a man apart. So someone who's untouchable in terms of romance, in terms of social availability. He's a loner, and he travels.
I like Batman a little bit away.
or Humphrey Bogart, and he's just not available to you. He's unimpeachable. He's incorruptible, and this is why this mood of the city is as a requirement for noir is why Los Angeles and San Francisco were perfect places for this 60 years ago, and now when you look around the world, I can think of no better place than Tel Aviv as a beautiful setting for a noir because you have so much eruptive change and so much disruptive change and so many things coming, so many languages coming together and cultures clashing together. And I wanted to write a book. I was there on a VC trip, and I was on the Tayelet with my toes in the sand at one of the beach bars there near Bugrashov Beach, and I said, "Gee, I want to write a book, and I want to write a book, and I want to set it here in Tel Aviv." And so I love noir, and I wanted to write a book. This is important for our audience today. I think I wanted to write a book that took and treated Israel as a real place. So what does that mean? Israel. I just had an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post recently on this topic. Israel is discussed in many ways. That's not true. Israel is discussed in a couple of ways globally. One is that it's a high-tech place, startup nation, and the other, it's a place where there's something called the conflict, capital T, capital C, right, with Palestinians or with Arabs, whatever way we might define them, or the press might define them that moment. And of course, Israel's a real place. Israel's a real place where people have lives, where they have economic struggles, and it's not a place that in any way should be defined or is defined by the capital T, capital C, the conflict, right? So at the same time, Israel is a place of immigrants. It's a place of refugees, and Jews are wandering Jews finally with a place, a homeland, as a place of refugees. And I set this novel in Tel Aviv in the Sudanese refugee community. And I think your audience, which will probably have some legally trained people, will find this interesting in a second. I set this in the Sudanese refugee community, and you guys will be familiar with the idea that there are probably now about 1,000. There used to be about 2,000 Sudanese refugees who escaped generally Islamic terror in North and South Sudan, from South Sudan, who made their way across Northern Africa and into Israel as a place they were looking for economic and personal refuge. And Israel became a wealthy country in the last 20 years and is a place where you might want to be as a refugee looking for economic refuge. And Israel's Tsuris, its discussion internally about the Sudanese refugee challenge, problem, question, event, phenomenon is, I think, a superb lens and way into the real life of Israel and the things that go on in the minds of Jews and Israelis around the world that are not just about the conflict. One of the things that turned me on to this particular topic, and this is, I think, where some of you are legally trained. I think 70% of your audience is probably legally trained, even though they're all marketers. Some of your legally trained audience will find this interesting. When Israel was born, of course, there was a legal technology that was created to allow for a right of return of Jews. And also there was a legal technology that cognized the local Jews who were there before the modern state of Israel existed. And then there were a bunch of laws, regulations, and procedures for either Israeli Arabs or displaced person Palestinians and so forth. There was basically no other immigration technology created at the time. There was no other legal regime created at the time because nobody else wanted to go to Israel. Who wanted to move to Israel who's not a Jewish refugee or someone who was wanting to return or go there as an Israeli Arab or as a Palestinian or Jerusalemite and so forth. So when the Sudanese refugees showed up about 15 years ago, plus minus, there was no legal way to cognize them. They had no status. There was no way to actually process them. So here we have a country of lawyers, okay, who are very familiar with being displaced and very familiar with being displaced for religious reasons, who did not know what to do with a group of people who had trekked 4,000 kilometers, whatever it was, circuitously across desert at peril of life and limb to arrive in Israel to live. And so, local Holocaust survivors were saying, yes, I want them here, or no, I don't want them in my neighborhood. And the government said, we don't know what to do. And so on and so on. And South Tel Aviv became a place that you'd look around the corner and say, where am I? Which part
Yeah.
of, so it's a police procedural story. Our narrator is an African guy who's lived in Israel for 20 years, who got there before the wave of Sudanese refugees. It's definitely a love poem to Tel Aviv. If you know Tel Aviv or like Tel Aviv, you will see that corner or that place or that street or that smell depicted in the book. And it's very, very important that we depict Israel as a real place. And the final thought on this is this. Set aside Israeli authors, because it's a whole other topic. If you look at American authors who write about Israel, there are basically two buckets of literature that they write that takes place in Israel. The first is biblical literature that takes place in Israel. So the story of this book of the Bible told through the eyes of this woman or that brother or this uncle instead of or retold through the eyes of the heroine or hero of the particular pasuk. Okay. Biblical stories, biblical era stories. That's bucket one. Very good books, by the way. Many of them, some of them not, but many of them very good. The second second category are books that took place in what you might call the heroic era of Israel. So 1948 plus minus to kind of the Yom Kippur War plus minus, when Israel was known throughout the world as accomplishing impossible thing after impossible thing, miracle after miracle, to breathe life into the country and to make the desert bloom. And sometimes since the Yom Kippur War, Israel has become more of a fact. Now you can argue whether it's really a fact because there are some nuclear lunatics out there in the neighborhood and it's a jungle neighborhood, and we know that. But Israel's more of a fact, and Israel's now suddenly more wealthy, thank God. Israel's suddenly more of a world power, thank God. And it's more, perhaps, I don't want to say inevitable, but it feels a little bit more inevitable than it did in 1955, to be sure, right? Mm-hmm. And so the literature by Americans has stopped at the Yom Kippur War. It's like, should Israel exist kind of stuff, or how does this family from across the Green Line deal with this family from the, Romeo and Juliet kinds of stories. But what a miss. What a miss, in my opinion. It is time for a new literature, I hope written by Americans, including this American with this book, that takes place in Israel, that understands Israel to be a real place where there are real people, some of whom are nice people, some of whom are not nice people, some of whom are Meshuggah people, some of whom are ethical people, some of whom are crooks. And that shows the face of Israel to the world. And the great news about this book, the thing I'm proudest of so far, is that the first group of readers, the book launched in the UK, and the first group of readers were largely women. Women read more than men in fiction anyway these days, and thank God for the women readers that we all rely on them as writers. But we're largely women, I think almost all women, English speakers across continental Europe, almost none of whom had ever been to Israel. And probably, I assume, I don't know, almost none of whom were Jewish. And what they loved about the book was that there was a postcard from Tel Aviv, from Israel, that made them want to visit Israel.
That's cool.
And it allowed them to see Israel as a place that was real and not defined by
the media
he said 10 minutes ago.
Right. Or even worse, Twitter.
Or, I mean, forget Twitter. I mean, Twitter. My God. Right? Oh my goodness. So, yeah, Twitter. So here's a real book for a real place, and I hope that. And by the way, I'm very glad to say that my Israeli friends have read it either as a favor to me or because they wanted to, and have loved it as well. It's not a long book. It is a book that will make you feel great about Israel, but also make you feel great about Israel because it treats Israel as a real place with real humans.
Right. It sounds like a beach read, no?
And it's a murder mystery, and you got a solution. What'd you say?
There you go. It sounds kind of like a great beach read, would you say?
It could be a beach read. Yeah, I'm not offended by a beach read. I think.
No, I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I mean, I mean that as the highest compliment.
No, it's okay. I understand. It does not require the kind of attention you would need for a technical white paper, for example, for Bitcoin.
Got it. Right.
So it doesn't require that kind of attention.
When I was reading Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I'm like, holy crap, this is way too much brain power. It's not enjoyable.
Oh, okay. No. Yeah, this is more of a serious book like that in that sense. So yeah. So I guess that. So the one thing that really should be true about a noir novel is that it's atmospheric. It should be mood, and you should want to read it. So it can be, you can, in that sense, it's perhaps more of an evening read than a morning breakfast read.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
So in that sense,
That means
yeah,
I'll have to put down my cell phone in the evening, usually after working at night.
right, it's probably better than looking at Twitter in the evening, right? Like, right?
Yeah, so definitely going to be an upgrade
That's
for
a
me
low bar, but
when
yeah,
it
it's probably better than looking
when
at
it
Twitter.
arrives. And it's actually fascinating because I told you, I have a side hobby. I don't really tell people, but the YouTube channel I started, Israel Unfiltered, was because everyone talks about Israel through either a religious lens or a political lens, and I can't stand that. And I'm really into the culture and the individuals and the people and the personalities and the Nobel Prizes and the technology and just the amazing things that are going on here, and it just gets neglected in the music scene. And so and in my opinion, of course I'm biased, but of course I'm right, that it's probably the most interesting culture by far, and has the most nationalities per capita. It's not even close. I mean, America is a distant second, and there isn't even a third place for regarding immigration by nationalities. Different nationalities per capita is such a melting pot here. It's unbelievable that the different cultures that are created, and then subcultures, and then each generation has its own culture and subculture, and it's really fascinating. And I think there's a lot to learn and a lot of stories that are not told, and I love that you're actually highlighting that in your book, and that is tangible.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that. And by the way, there is a connection between tech and this book, in the sense that tech is not some kind of politicized Jewish export of Israel, right? Mm-hmm. It is a commercial, universal export of Israel, right? So if you're a cyber customer in India or in the United States or in Mexico, you're not getting Jewish cyber protection. You're getting cyber protection that's made by an Israeli company. And in that sense, Israel is a real place that's not highly defined by a religion or a political dispute. And dare I say, and maybe I'm saying a little too much, for better and for perhaps for worse, so much of Israeli literature now, coming from Israeli authors, is sort of, the arts are always a little bit left. That's sort of the nature of things. But there's a kind of almost self-flagellating leftism in some of the arts coming out of Israel, where it's like, how much worse you're seeing this in America, right, too, this kind of left sort of
it's very radical. It's who can be more radical, and it's to get the clicks.
Let's it's like the mission of the literature is to focus the eyes of the world exactly on the conflict, and there's room for that. There's room for that in literature. No doubt, there's room for that in literature. But there's so much more to tell.
Right.
And it's like saying, you know what, we're going to go to an Italian restaurant, and the only thing that's offered the Italian restaurant is bruschetta. That's it. You can only get bruschetta ever.
Right. Right.
The menu looks like it's got 1,000 items, but you're only ever allowed to eat bruschetta. Right. And I think that's the problem that's coming out.
Imagine if Chicago's only talked about their crime. Only, or New York, their crime.
There's no city there.
Crime. That's all we're going to talk about is the murder rate, which is insane.
Right. There's no city, right?
Chicago's got a lot going on.
There's no university system, right?
There's no culture. There's none of that.
You talked about, just to leave you on the thought, because I'm trying this out on my Israeli audiences now. You talked about a Boca Raton for Israel. I wonder what would happen if it would be good for Israel to have more than IDC, but like, let's say Beersheba did a proper 4-year degree in English. And that if you were a person from around the world, maybe a Jewish American, but maybe a Chinese person with no religious affiliation associated with Israel, you could do a 4-year great degree as an undergraduate in Israel. Would that be one of the best things that Israel could do for itself, to have graduates, college graduates, who might stay in Israel or who might go back with positive impressions and experiences and ties to Israel, instead of kind of like, 4-year degrees only in Hebrew, or kind of the beginning of one in IDC. I'm going to Tel Aviv U, Hebrew U.
So I did an international MBA in English. It was like a year and a half at Bar Ilan. I know Tel Aviv also has one in Tel Aviv University.
And there's an MD program. There's a medical program too. But I'm talking about an undergrad degree.
Right. So that people can go there, right? And it's not just like an international year, but a full 3 to 4 years, you're saying.
Yeah. By the way, if you're an American parent right now and you're looking at the sort of wokistan politics of top American colleges,
it is terrible, dude.
Would you consider a very good 4-year degree program at Ben Gurion? I mean,
right. In general, I don't recommend college, with the exception of STEM, and even then some, to be honest. And I have an MBA, and I studied at Temple University, magna cum laude, and double major and all that. I studied finance and all that, but it was so bad then. And when did I graduate? 2008. I graduated from Temple University for my undergrad, and it is I wouldn't. I try to actively encourage people not to go to university, not because it's a breeding ground for bigotry, racism, and anti-Semitism, but in addition to, you don't learn anything that's practical. What's right now, whatever's relevant now, is not. Let's say you're learning marketing. It's not relevant. What you learned in your freshman year, come junior year, isn't even relevant anymore. As an example, as a digital marketer.
I'm hearing this objection more and more often. I don't share it. I confess, but I do hear smart people make this objection. I do think there's room for kind of little L, little A, liberal arts educations. I think there's value in it unto itself.
I agree with that. Right.
But I do hear your objection. I hear it also from others. However, I will say, wouldn't it be great if some of the best and brightest had a top Israeli institution as an option for their undergraduate? And I don't know. That's my pitch, and maybe your audience will think about it.
I like that, because like, I think that, and James Altucher calls it idea sex. Were you familiar with that phrase? Like,
I'm not. No.
No. Do you know what James Altucher is?
I'm sorry. I should, but I don't.
Okay, I don't know if you should or shouldn't, but he's great. He's an American. He's in Florida now. He left New York. He actually was big in the media. He wrote this big piece, I think, in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, how New York isn't going to rebound. And like Jerry Seinfeld and all these New Yorkers like responded. But he's a big tech and business guy. He's got a great podcast for business and entrepreneurship. He's a Jewish guy with crazy curly hair. And he does something called idea sex, where like you take this idea. So my idea was like, all right, maybe a retirement community. And then you had yours, well, what about education? And then maybe someone can put together like a retirement and education and a package for families that want to retire and have kids entering college, maybe something to come together. And someone will maybe take these ideas, add their perspective, they'll do it. And then we don't even know it. We're going to find out someone actioned something. And it was because, and we played a part, right? We played a part you don't even know, just by these conversations that we're having.
Well, I'm very happy for someone else to do it and take all the credit in the world for it.
Yeah,
I do think it'd be good. I do think it'd be good for Israel. I think it'd be good for the world. I think it'd be great for the Jews. It'd be great for all the non-Jews who go there. Imagine having like 200 amazing top-level Chinese undergraduates, per year, living in Israel, and what that would do for China and China, Israel, and then Americans, 200 top Americans going there, and then U.S., China. Like, I mean, it's what an amazing thought. Listen, we have to stop, Yoel. We're having such a good time, but we're over.
I know, right? And it always takes a while to break in. And I think it's because we should have talked about your book in the beginning. That would have been more interesting. But I definitely wanted to get the VC.
We had a good conversation, and I'm very glad that we had these great questions from your audience, and I hope they can find me on LinkedIn, whether they're watching live or later. And Yoel, I wish you the greatest of success with your ingenious and innovative podcast and videocast and broadcast and LinkedIn Live and YouTube channel. I think it's going to be a great success. I'm sure of it.
Thank you, Michael. Michael's book, you can find Hipset. I put it in the comments. Also, when this is uploaded to YouTube, we'll make sure to include in the comments then. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. And it's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Am Yisrael Chai.
Yeah, amen.